Welcome everybody to our latest Clean Tech Nation Briefing Series webinar. My name is Bryce Yonker, Director of Business Development here at CleanEdge, and we're excited to have over 200 participants for today's session. Ron Pernick, our Managing Director, is going to be moderating the conversation, but before we kick things off, I just wanted to share a few quick housekeeping notes. If you've never used the GoToMeeting webinar platform before, it's a very interactive and very easy to use tool. We would encourage people to be sending their questions in throughout. So there's a chat box and a question field. You can drop that down and type any of your questions in. We'll be fielding those throughout today's webinar and getting to as many as we possibly can. As well, that's the way to interact with the session. We have all the participants currently in listen-only mode, but these are interactive discussions, so please do send in your questions for the panelists. In the coming months, we're going to be hosting a few additional webinars on a range of topics, from clean energy consumer attitudes after a homeowner survey that we're conducting, and breakthroughs in energy storage marketplace. So if you're interested in learning more about partnering on future Clean Tech Nation sessions, you can contact me, and you should have my email address. So I'm going to hand it over to CleanEdge's founder and managing director, Ron Pernick, and he's going to be moderating today's session.
Thanks, Bryce, and I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar on the topic of clean tech and the China equation. As many of you know, over the past decade, China has gone from being a clean tech neophyte to leading the charge on both clean energy manufacturing and deployment. What will the next decade bring? Will China achieve its ambitions of becoming a major force in terms of new product design and innovation? And how will the world's two clean tech leaders, the U.S. and China, as well as players like Japan, collaborate moving forward? With us today to help us unpack and better understand these issues and more are Gary Reichel, founding managing partner at Keeming Venture Partners, who joins us today from Shanghai. Jake Lays, head of sustainability and clean tech in the Asia Pacific for Autodesk. He's joining us from Hong Kong. And Mark Clifford, executive director of the Asia Business Council and author of a really great forthcoming book, The Greening of Asia. And he's joining us as well from Hong Kong. Today's webinar is made possible by our partner and co-host Autodesk. For years, Autodesk has been at the forefront of clean tech and sustainability initiatives, leading the charge on the design-led revolution. We've been fortunate at CleanEdge to be helping them with their Clean Tech Partner Program, which serves innovators in the U.S. and across the globe. They recently launched, just a week and a half ago, their Clean Tech Partner Program in China. To find out more about the Clean Tech Partner Program, as well as the design-led revolution, please visit their website, and we've got links here. Just a quick overview of today's agenda. Many of you have been on our webinars before. I'm going to set the stage briefly with some slides. We'll go into conversation with the panelists with some lead-in questions. We'll then open up to the audience. So as Bryce said, please type your questions into the chat box or into the question box. You'll see where you can do that, and then we'll queue those up and get to as many of them as we possibly can. So thank you. Let me just sort of set the stage here a bit. You know, the activity in China to me has just been immense, and as noted earlier, you know, if you look at this slide here, you can see the ranking. China is now number one in the most recent Ernst & Young Renewable Energy Attractiveness Index rankings. That isn't what it looked like a decade ago, so quite a bit of activity. Let me show you why, some of the reasons behind that incredible increase for China. If you look at this slide here, you can just see how much they've moved up in a range of indicators over the past decade. China's gone from number 4 to number 2 globally in terms of cumulative solar PV installations, and they now lead the world in annual new installations of solar PV. China's gone from number 10 in cumulative wind in 2004 to number 1 in 2013. In regards to solar PV shipments, the nation went from 1% of total shipments in 2004 to a whopping 48%, nearly half of all shipments in 2012. That's the latest year we have data for. So it's probably grown similarly in the last year or two. It now leads the world in total clean energy investments. The latest Bloomberg New Energy Finance data shows $89.5 billion in 2014, beating out the U.S.'s $51.8 billion, number 2 slot, and Japan at $41.3 billion. And as I mentioned in the Ernst & Young rankings, China has moved up 18 spots from 19 in 2004 to number 1, all in the past decade. Moving forward, a number of trends are at play. China is on target to get more than 11% of its energy from renewable sources by the end of 2015, with more aggressive targets on tap, looking at about likely 20% by 2030. The recently announced joint U.S. China Climate Agreement has been touted by many analysts as an historic development. We'll be talking about that today. And of course, China's pollution issues have become untenable, making clean energy a national imperative. There are a host of other challenges facing China's clean tech innovators, however, ranging from weak IP protection laws to a dearth of open networks and open innovation channels that are standard operating procedure in most other countries. Think access to Google. The big question for many is if China can move from being primarily a manufacturer to being an innovation and design powerhouse. So let's take a closer look at all of that. And what I'd like to do is jump in with you, Gary. In your role at Qiming, you've been investing actively in China for more than a decade. I remember sitting down with you when we were writing our first book back in 2006, and you already had a great sense of the emerging clean tech opportunities in China. There were just a few people who kind of got that. Over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you see as the key prospects for continued clean tech growth in China? And can you help paint a picture for us on what's happening on the ground over in China today? So, Gary, over to you.
All right, thanks, Ron. Yeah, I think that to jump right in, I think the real key transition that's occurred in the last 10 years has been the fact that implementation is now catching up with policy. The Chinese have had emissions laws on the books, wastewater treatment laws on the books for a very long time, many of which were crafted with the help of U.S. organizations like Environmental Defense. And what you see now is the fact that the penalty clauses and the implementation of those rules, the enforcement, is actually catching up with policy. And that's one major change. When we talked back in 2005, 2006 about this, we had ideas, but they were too early. So many of the investments at that time, it's taken much, much longer for them to mature. I think what's really critical to understand in terms of where the government is viewing this particular issue, the environmental issues that China faces, is that it's absolutely fundamental to recreating trust among in Chinese society. If you look back at the Cultural Revolution, people talk and write often about how there's a great lack of trust in many Chinese institutions. And one of the things that they did in healthcare, which is, I think, a leading indicator for what will happen in clean tech, is they actually, or the environment, they were very aggressive in moving to world standards in healthcare testing. And that was driven by an unfortunate series of drugs that got in the market and caused the death of quite a few children back in 2003 to 2005. Clean tech and the issues for the environment are following down that path. So they don't really have a choice. This isn't one where the 5-year plan will ever change and say, well, we no longer need to care about the environment. So the power and the inertia now behind driving better and better environmental opportunities, environmental situation in China is kind of a one-way street. I think the last point I'd make for the first additional comments are that innovation's ramping up. And innovation in the clean tech area has not really been driven by China to this point. But because of the scale of the problems, the very scale of those problems will drive innovation. And so many of the solutions that China will come up with will be solutions that operate at scale, particularly in wastewater treatment and waste to value. And they'll have great applicability in other markets around the world as things go forward.
great. And I'd like to come back to waste to value later. That's a perfect segue to our next question for Mark. And Mark, in your forthcoming book, and I had a chance to see a preview copy, The Greening of Asia, you did a really amazing job painting a picture of the extremely bleak environmental situation in China. Gary sort of started to mention that. And yet you also strike a very optimistic tone on the business opportunities coming out of the crisis. In fact, you make a pretty strong and powerful case for the end of new coal in China, which seems hard to believe today. Considering how reliant the nation is today on fossil fuels, how realistic is such a shift, and what's it going to take to get there? I know there's a lot there, but why don't you help us unpack a little bit of that?
Sure. Thanks so much, Ron. Well, I agree with what Gary was saying, but let me take a slightly more downbeat start to this, which is let's just remind ourselves about the scale. About 1 of every 5 people in the world live in China, but China is burning half the world's coal. So that's the bad news. The good news is that the leadership, as Gary was saying, recognizes they have a serious problem with trust, potentially one that could threaten their continued rule over the country. And they are highly motivated to do something. And they are, as Gary said, starting to work with real laws, real implementation, and innovation. And the good news is it's so bad that there's a huge room for improvement. And MIT and its counterpart in China, Tsinghua, have recently come out with a study that shows coal use could peak in China in the early 2020s. That's almost 10 years ahead of when the U.S. China Agreement you mentioned signed in December envisioned. So I think that China can do a lot. The leadership just really needs to grasp the nettle and move very hard, very fast. It's great at top-down policies, and as Gary said, it's starting to move more on real implementation at the grassroots level, where it's lagged in the past. But we're now seeing officials at the local level being held to account. We're seeing real penalties for companies, but above all for responsible officials. And I think the fact that China is starting to get serious because its leadership is having to deal with issues like an 8-year-old girl in an inland province who lived in a very polluted area being diagnosed with lung cancer. These incidents get publicity around the country. They're often shut down, but people do know about them. They've suffered through the air apocalypse of Beijing in the last couple of winters, where the average day is like a raging forest fire. I mean, the pollution is off the charts. So it's a horrible situation, but that means that there's room for relatively easy improvement. And if the projections from the MIT Tsinghua study are correct, we could see a peak within 5 years rather than in 15 years. So I think that's the great news.
Great, Mark. So we'll come back to some of the other trends that you're seeing and some of the levers that are being pulled. Let's go now to you, Jake. Autodesk recently, as I mentioned, expanded its cleantech partner program to mainland China. You're now working with entrepreneurs and others developing and prototyping cleantech products and services. From your vantage point, what are you witnessing at the intersection of China cleantech and what you guys have really been forwarding as the design-led revolution? So over to you, Jake.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, there's been some really good comments already made by Gary and by Mark. I totally agree with. So the Autodesk Cleantech program has been around since 2009, and we've been really looking at China for some time now. Obviously the investments shows what's happening in this market in the 5-year plan. But what I have seen over just the last couple of months and the last year is in conversations that we had with government and government agencies is a very strong expressed general support, and I would even say urgency by the government to help technology innovation to happen in China by Chinese startups and SMEs. So it's very much an aim for the designs in China rather than the made in China. And so actually when we launched our program 1.5 weeks ago on the 21st of January, we found that support, and also had entered a strategic partnership with an organization called the China Industrial Energy Conservation and Cleaner Production Association, or CIE, CCPA. But what's actually even more a little bit important, I'd say, is that what we are seeing more and more is is also especially young entrepreneurs, some of them who essentially just sort of finished studies, maybe overseas, and then come back, and who are inspired by some of these environmental challenges as an important, but also as a very tremendous opportunity to imagine, design, and create some new innovations. And so they find each other at incubators. There is a explosion of maker spaces and hacker spaces, and I think there's quite a big interest in designing a livable future, which is sort of all based on the overall economic development that creates this sort of demand gap for solutions for a greener future, really.
Great. Well, let's do this, guys, because the government obviously it's critical interacting with the government in China. You said it's very top down. Sometimes that can be very envious, invoking envy in the U.S. because you can get things done, but it also is a very different environment. One thing that I've noticed, we touched upon it very briefly, are the 5-year plans. These really drive what's happening in China. So I'm wondering, Gary, if we could start with you. So tell us a little bit, just very top line, what are you seeing in the 5-year plan? Why is it so important? And then I'd like to hear from the other speakers a little bit about sort of what we might expect in the next 5-year plan that's coming. Gary, can you lay the groundwork here for us a little bit on the 5-year plans and what those do?
Yes, and I think it's important to understand that for the 5-year plans provide relatively broad brush outlines of where the government is going to invest its capital and its energy and its political will, if you want to phrase it that way. They're fantastic macro economic or macro level guidelines. So what you don't want to do in China is you probably shouldn't count on the 5-year plan guaranteeing the success of your business, but you can pretty much guarantee that if you're flying directly in the face of those plans and in the specific parts of them that affect your organization, you're highly unlikely to be successful, and that's probably more true for this administration than for any of the 2 or 3 prior ones. I think that China's been talking about indigenous innovation, creating more of a platform for its own technology. And what's been interesting is that was initially simply a platitude because they didn't really know what that meant. They believed that simply by bringing back brilliant Chinese trained overseas and giving them capital and giving them access to resources that that they would suddenly foster a Silicon Valley-like atmosphere across the country. And I think Mark knows better than me. I think it's something like 55 to 60 rather significant science parks that sprung up all over the country with significant capital. But they missed the fact that going back to the issue of trust and going back to the issue of rule of law, intellectual property protection, there was quite a bit in the infrastructure surrounding innovation that wasn't in place. And I think now, particularly, healthcare has, I think, crossed the threshold there. I think clean tech is definitely in the sights to cross the threshold. What we're seeing on enforcement and wastewater investments we have, oil extraction industry cleanup, the solar industry, manufacturing principles. So many of these things now are lining up again with really establishing more of both an innovation platform and the kind of penalty system being enforced that actually will drive that.
Great. Well, I want to come back to open innovation later and sort of those innovation platforms, and I know Jake will probably have some thoughts on that as well. But Mark, I'm wondering, I know you've looked a little bit at the upcoming 5-year plan. What are some things we might expect and also coming out of the agreements between the U.S. and China, but what are some of the overarching guidelines or goals we might see coming out of the 5-year plan or the upcoming 5-year plan?
Sure, yeah. So this will be the plan that will run from 2016 to 2020, starting next year. And as Gary said, these are broad guidelines, but if you don't want to go against them, you want to be with them. And if you're a Chinese wind turbine manufacturer, you're going to be really happy. China already has about 100 gigawatts of wind, and they're going to have 200 gigawatts of wind. That would make their wind capacity alone larger than Germany's entire electrical generating base. It would be larger than all but about 5 other countries in the world. So you're going to see similar things in solar, in nuclear, to a lesser degree in hydro. So anything in clean tech is going to have money thrown at it. We're also going to see more experimentation with things like carbon emissions trading systems. We're going to see some real discussion about setting carbon emissions peak goal and capping coal consumption, some of the things that you've talked about. And I think the U.S. China Climate Agreement plays into that, and I'm very interested and heartened to see that U.S. Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker will be leading a delegation of U.S. business leaders to China in April that's explicitly focused on the clean tech sector and on trying to really make something concrete out of this agreement that President Obama and President Xi Jinping signed in December. So, you know, the trend is in the right direction, but as Gary said, that doesn't mean your business is going to succeed, but it's better to be going with the current than trying to swim upstream against it.
So I think it's helpful to get that idea that this is overarching. It gives guidelines, and you kind of want to go with that. And obviously, the goals are pretty aggressive. We have a lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders on today's webinar, and I'm just wondering, what are some of the critical lessons for doing business in China? Because obviously, this goes both ways. There's companies that are Chinese that want to export, but there's also U.S. and other foreign companies coming into China. So I'm just wondering. And maybe Gary, we'll just start with you because I know you've worked with a lot of different companies. But what steps does an American company need to take that's looking to enter the Chinese market? And again, I know it's a broad question, but kind of give us an idea of some of the considerations of what sets a company up for success if they want to work with some of the innovators in China as well.
So I'll be just a couple bullet points. One is, when you come to China, you should know what you want. And when you come to China to identify partners or people to work with, you should not be in a hurry. The biggest mistake I see many foreign firms, U.S. and others, make coming to China is they come on a tour, a couple-week tour, and they meet a few folks, and then they suddenly think that they've identified their, partner for life, if you will, in doing business in China. So I think there's a huge mismatch in kind of the idea, well, we have to be in China. You get a sense of urgency about that, and then I think you start making poor mistakes. The other thing that has changed in our, the last 10 years since we've been in Shanghai, is the ability to do diligence now is actually quite good. And I think when people say, well, it's hard to do diligence in China, I just don't think they're trying hard enough. I actually think you can do very good diligence in China, but it takes time. And I think the final point would be the people that you would hire for your U.S. operations. If you're really serious about China, find one of those folks who's willing to come over here. Because the other big mistake that happens is a firm will set up operations in China, either a joint venture or subsidiary. They hire people in China, but the people back at headquarters typically don't know those folks. So when issues come up, you go back to, well, can we really trust what they say? Do we understand what's motivating them? And what that does is create an incredible amount of delay and just lack of confidence in your people on the ground. So the best possible thing you can do is find a really senior person in your organization that's willing to come over here and plant themselves here for a year or two to help launch whatever you're planning on doing.
Great. And Jake and Mark, what other, you're both located there. That's one of the reasons we set up this webinar the way we did. We wanted people who are, in Asia and working with China. What do you guys give as advice to American companies and others looking to work with in China?
Jake, you want to go ahead? I'll come in after you.
Yes. So I'd say, as I mentioned earlier, I think that we see quite some interest now in seeing innovations happening in China. So I think one interesting point of access or point of entry of scoping out the market would be to look into some of the industry associations that are looking into clean energy specifically, but also looking at organizations like incubators that slowly sort of come up as well here and there as a way of connecting with others as well. I think what Gary was saying is very true. It's important to look at this over a period of time and not to rush into it. Important to go and see who else is out there. I think the other thing is to also have a look at the industry parks, some of them who have a very specific focus or look at getting clean technology companies into their campuses as a way of understanding who is already there and what's happening there.
Mark, do you have other advice to add?
Well, just quickly, I think both Jake and Gary are spot on, but to underscore what Gary said, don't leave your brains at the door. I mean, people treat China, they really mystify. It's the mysterious East. It's not. You do your due diligence, you use your common sense, and you hire really, really carefully. And that's getting easier now as the economy slows. I think it's easier to attract and retain good talent. I think Gary's point about bringing your U.S. employees over to China is good, but you also want to make sure your Chinese employees, the good ones, get to go to the States and see that they have a future. There's a saying here, same bed, different dreams, and often there is a real difference between what the foreign partner wants and what the Chinese partner wants. And if you look at the wind industry, you can see this very clearly, where the Chinese didn't really know what they want, as Gary was alluding to with technology transfer a decade or so ago. They invited a lot of foreign companies in. In 2004, foreign companies had 78% of the wind turbine market in China. 5 years later, in 2009, they had 14%. So the Chinese share went from almost nothing to overwhelming, and they got that through help from their foreign partners. So if you go in, you really want to keep your eyes open and make sure that, hopefully same bed, same dreams.
Great, and I do want to remind everyone on the call that we are taking questions. They're starting to come in. We're getting great ones. I'm going to go to those shortly, so please keep getting those in. Bryce is sort of moderating them for me and sending them over, and I'm starting to see them. So, yeah, please type those in. So you guys, back in the 80s, I lived in Japan for 3 to 4 years. I studied there. And obviously the popular American refrain at the time was that Japanese could copy but not develop new and innovative solutions. I was on the ground in Japan, and I knew that was, a completely dated view, and that Japan was leading and would lead innovation in a host of technology sectors. I mean, they clearly got things like hybridization of vehicles well before the U.S. seemed to be willing to get it. So I'm just wondering, and I think you started to allude to this, Mark, but is the same true today in China? Are we likely just, thinking that all they can do is manufacture, but in fact they're going to become innovation powerhouse? And what's that going to look like? So, Mark, why don't we start with you and then go to Jake and Gary?
Sure. I mean, quickly, because I think Jake and Gary will be well positioned to answer this. I think, as in Japan, that's a very outdated view. First of all, the competition, the domestic competition in China is unbelievably fierce, far worse than it was in Japan, and that competition is driving innovation. It may not be groundbreaking Nobel Prize sort of innovation, but it's innovation. Just look at smartphones. Look at what Xiaomi and other smartphone companies have done. Look at what Alibaba and Tencent have done. We're seeing a revolution that is actually being driven by China in a lot of the digital space. We're not seeing that necessarily in, let's say, clean tech services, but this is a very, very innovative, very competitive country, and I think you're absolutely right to warn people against dismissing China as somehow just a bunch of copycat manufacturers, which I think is a very outdated view.
Jake, Gary, what are you guys seeing?
Jake, go ahead.
I totally agree. I totally agree, and I have to hold myself back because there could be a very long answer here. But essentially, I think there are really three reasons. Well, first of all, a growing middle class continues to push for a more comfortable, greener, and healthy environment. Given that there was a one-child policy, there are many parents who like to have naturally so the very best for their child, and I think that includes healthy, clean, green environment. And with what we read about pollution and everything, as I said earlier, there will be a demand gap for new ideas, solutions, and innovations that will trigger local innovations or innovators and entrepreneurs to focus on, and it's already happening. The second thing is what goes very much hand in hand with this is just this change towards a more domestic consumption and service-focused economy. So less these massive investments and focus on manufactured export. I think the share of services as part of the GDP and employment is projected to rise, and that's a clear direction that I think will foster some of these developments even further. And then thirdly, and I think that's probably even the strongest reason, is it's basically there's an emergence of a new generation of designers and innovators everywhere in China and everywhere else. And these entrepreneurs, they take advantage of what's possible that wasn't possible only a couple of years or a decade earlier. Today, with technology, you can, rapidly optimize a design much faster and make the best possible solution. Or you can understand the impact of a product before it's being built, or you can collaborate much easier. And I think these sort of things, in combination with the Chinese entrepreneurial spirit to overcome challenges, I wouldn't be surprised. I would be surprised not to see some very unique design happening in China, especially also in the clean technology space. You mentioned Japan. It's a little bit like, as Clayton Christensen described in Innovator's Dilemma. New technologies and business models have the potential to seriously disrupt the normal, and I think we'll see that here as well.
Gary, anything to add to this part of the dialogue?
Yeah, the way that I'd summarize it is that innovation is not magic. Innovation requires certain ingredients. It requires obviously bright people that are capable of being creative. It requires need. Something needs to change. Innovation is a painful process, and so if there isn't a need in the marketplace, then people aren't really willing to change. And then it needs capital, if you're looking at it from the standpoint of what we're talking about for industrial innovation. And it's, China at one point in time may not have had all those three ingredients, but if you look at clean tech, Mark spoke very clearly about what the need is. It's clearly, brilliant people here, and there's as much money here now in clean tech investment or more, as we talked about, than in the United States. And I think China's right in the middle of making the transition from being really good at designing and manufacturing discrete products to being able to design and manufacture complex systems. That has always been the weakness for many of the Chinese companies, but you start to look across the globe now, and what we're seeing on a pretty broad basis is the ability of the Chinese to provide very integrated systems as opposed to discrete components is starting to explode. And I think that's where you finally have a complete end-to-end innovation platform here.
So this is very interesting to me. Without folks who haven't been to China, it's probably hard to capture that entrepreneurial spirit that's there. I remember even going back before it was becoming as capitalist as it is today, and I was there in the mid '80s. I was one of the first people allowed into China as a backpacker when I was in college, and I was amazed at sort of in interactions with business people, just how they were willing and dealing with me, and it. Now when I go back, and I don't go often, but when I've gone back, I've been amazed with the innovative entrepreneurial activity. That said, just to be a devil's advocate for a second, in the U.S. and Europe and other places, I read every day about open innovation and open networks and how that's really driving so much of the activity and disruption we're seeing today. Is China going to allow that kind of open innovation to happen? And are they allowing it, but just on their own platforms? Because I just don't know from my vantage point here. All I can think of, I can't use Google when I'm in China. So what's going on? Are we going to see that kind of the networks to let that innovation flourish and sort of in an open systems framework? Does that make sense? Maybe start with you, Gary.
Let's start with Gary. I want to come back, and I might add something at the end, but I think Gary will probably be pretty optimistic about this.
Yeah, I would say that it's a very good point, but it's actually becoming more and more limited to really the social media, kind of media and social networking elements. If you look at what's happening in medical devices, we have a huge healthcare practice, and I would say half the companies we see now have, particularly in medical devices, products that the folks at the leading U.S. firms would say they can't do that yet. and that's something that's a new phenomenon over the last 3 to 5 years. When you look at what's happening in solar, what's happening in wind, you're finally, now that you have capital constraints in China, you're finally starting to have to rationalize these industries. So not every firm that has the idea can just go off and set up a PV manufacturing line. So again, the constraint of capital will wind up causing only the better people to be able to participate in the market. So you're going to have to be moving away from competing only on price to being able to competing on value. And again, China will go through that sector by sector. There will be examples for the next 20 years on how they can't do it, and there's just going to start being more and more examples of how they're doing it really well.
Mark, I think you were going to maybe add to that.
Yeah, I think the reason we're probably none of us wanted to jump in is it's such a complicated question, because on the one hand you have this intensely authoritarian top-down government, which, if you were to believe the Western media, is squelching people every day. And, there are people being squelched, but the reality is you've got 1.3 billion people who are going through a growth of a sort, of a scale, an intensity, a duration that the world has never seen. It's not just the number. It's the amount of time, 30 years of 8 to 10% growth. I mean, the UK during the Industrial Revolution grew about 1.2, 1.8% a year. I mean, the scale of this is unbelievable, and yet it's not a free market California-style entrepreneurialism culture, as you hinted at. I call it startup statism. You've got incredible direction from the top in the form of 5-year plans and a lot of other government directives. You have a lot of the capital being allocated by the state-controlled banks, but not necessarily from Beijing, often from local people, with local banks working with the local officials who can give tax breaks, give land, and are really focused on jobs. So you have, and Gary, as Gary points out, this era may be coming to an end, but we had hundreds of solar companies. And the biggest and best of them, SunTech, went out of business because it just grew too fast. And so on the one hand, you've got this incredible entrepreneurial, innovative culture which is driving down prices, which is as Gary said, making all these improvements in products. And on the other hand, they aren't always sustainable companies that you'd want to invest in. They're not always companies. They're usually not companies like we're used to seeing in the States. So it's a very, very difficult question to answer, but I think you have to figure that the creative destruction we're seeing will ultimately redound to China's benefit.
Well, and I liked what you made the point, Gary, that sure, for social media networks maybe, but not necessarily within the entrepreneurial business landscape. So we'll get to watch that, and thank you guys for all helping us navigate that a bit. We're getting lots of questions from the audience now, so I'm going to start to go to those. You guys obviously haven't seen any of these questions. That you may or may not be able to address all of them, but let's kind of dig in because there are a lot. So one of the questions from the audience is that China invested billions in the U.S. in 2014 and prior years in this sector, and they basically ask, what do you see as potential magnitude of China outbound FDI in the U.S. renewable energy sector and clean tech over the next 2 to 5 years? So are you guys, from your vantage point, are you able to get an idea of, in terms of foreign direct investment, what are some of the sectors that might be of most interest to Chinese strategic and financial investors and where they might deploy their capital?
So I guess this is Gary, I'll jump in on one piece of that, which is we've helped a number of Chinese firms. We have a spin-out firm from Qiming that actually helped bring U.S. technology into China, and they're getting more and more requests now from the large Chinese companies saying, okay, we need access to this technology to improve our gross margins in China, and it also allows us to have a foothold as we start to expand overseas. So the two reasons that I think that if that outbound FDI will occur from China is part of it's the market opportunity, or the technology acquisition opportunity. Part of it is, frankly, a lot of these folks look overseas and they look at other markets as being much less competitive. To Mark's point, it's much less competitive for them there than it is here. And so we have companies that their reason for going overseas is the margins are better because they don't have 5, 6, 7, 10 Chinese companies breathing down their neck competing with them on every deal. And so I think that dynamic is absolutely going to continue to increase.
Mark or Jake, anything to add on FDI investments and where those might get deployed in the U.S. in particular?
Well, this is Mark. On a macro level, I think the trend we're going to see, or certainly over the next 5 or 10 years, will be massive expansion in investment abroad. It's often very opportunistic. So again, I think this means companies that want to be in front of Chinese investors, potentially Chinese investors, need to spend time in China because some of them know people like Gary, companies like Gary's, and some of them don't. They just they're not always that well-rounded, that well-versed in what the international network looks like in their field. So I think the trend is in the right direction. It'll be interesting to see what the slowing economy and the crackdown on corruption and on money going abroad means for foreign investment. But I think for legitimate, meaningful, especially tech-oriented foreign investment, the trend is extremely positive.
Great. Jake, should I move on, or do you have anything to add to that one?
No, I think that was well covered. I think
great. This is a question. It's interesting. It came up. We did a panel about a year and a half ago or maybe a year ago in Japan, and one of the great things happening in Japan right now is sort of the liberalization reform of electricity markets. And I have to be honest, I know nothing about this in China. So here's the question, and you guys can just quickly tell us if there's something here or not. So it says, could the panel elaborate on the impact of the potential electricity reform or liberalization in China? Open energy markets and competition is certainly having an impact in Japan and parts of the U.S. Are we going to see anything like that in China? So I don't know who on the call might know, but is there a reform happening, and what's that looking like, and how might that impact clean energy players?
So this is Jake. I haven't heard any very specific news about reform happening very soon. I may have missed that. But what I do have seen by speaking to some entrepreneurs is I think it's sort of an increased focus on distributed energy solutions and off-grid solutions as well. And I feel that may be it's not necessarily the same thing, but I feel that there is some further focus, that we'll probably see some further focus in that area.
Gotcha. And
this is Mark. I might have missed something too, but my concern is actually on the other side. You've had an enormous amount of wind capacity in particular, which is either not hooked up to the grid, hooked up very slowly, or they don't take the power because there's still just a couple of dominant national grid companies, and it's often not really clear why they take the power they do, but they might take it from a coal station they know rather than from a wind turbine operator that they're not as friendly with.
Yeah,
there's been a
Mark,
lot of
maybe you
that
could explain that to folks, because I mean this is an astounding part of the equation. I mean there's all of this capacity that's been brought online, but I don't even know the percent that's not connected. What's going on? Because that's a lot of capacity.
Yeah, it is a lot. And they decided they needed to build wind. People built wind. There were a lot of tax breaks. It was in form of national service. It wasn't always economic. They were slow to build the grid. They're spending a lot of money, tens, I think hundreds of billions of dollars building transmission lines throughout the country, and particularly to wheel. Yeah, well, particularly to wheel the power in from the remote northern and western regions. I think about 25% is not connected right now. My colleague's telling me. So that's an enormous amount of that. Sort of 100, 110 gigawatts of wind capacity. If 25% isn't connected, you can see the result. And even when it is connected, as I said, it's often what they call curtailment. They don't take the power. So my statistics a little out of date, but a couple of years ago, although the U.S. had less capacity than China, it was significantly less. It was actually producing more used electricity from its wind because it just ran the turbines more efficiently. So this gets back to an issue. China has this kind of build it and they will come attitude, and eventually they usually get it right, but it's not with always the same degree of capital or operating efficiency that we might be used to seeing in the States.
Hey, Ron, this is Gary. Can I add one thing?
Please.
It's really important when you look about what's happening in Japan to understand why, and there's one word, Fukushima.
Absolutely.
Without that disaster, you would not see TEPCO and the Japanese grid managers embracing what they're having what they're having to go through now. I mean,
absolutely.
So I think that you are not going to see State Grid or Southern Grid in China do anything like that for the very foreseeable future.
So your point is it was driven by necessity in Japan and all the
Absolutely.
nuclear power that came offline. Okay. And by the way, that was the framing for our Japan conversation, because that's changed everything. Well, I've got a couple questions here that do kind of go back to what's driving the move, because clearly China is doing something. They're doing a both-and approach, an all-of-the-above approach. So they're deploying as much renewables as they can, and they're deploying as much still coal and everything else. But I think both Mark and Gary, you sort of mentioned sort of the environmental issue, and Mark, you and I have spoken before about sort of the silent spring moment in China. Are we sort of there, and is it happening both from individuals on the ground, and then is the government, when you look at the actions they're doing with the U.S. climate and China climate initiatives, is climate change driving some of this, or is this, just give the audience a view of sort of what's driving all of this activity in China. Is climate and pollution sort of what's at the front and center for the change we're seeing? And Mark, why don't we start with you?
I guess I mean, there are so many problems. Again, you take that 8-year-old girl with lung cancer in Jiangsu, or you take air in Beijing that's like being in a bad forest fire, and you take the clusters of cancer villages, you take the fact that nobody would drink water from the tap in China, and people are at a point, I think, where they're saying enough is enough. We've worked hard for 30 years. The party has done great things for us, but we want our kids, as I guess Gary was alluding to before, Jake, you want your kids to be able to grow up in a healthy environment, and you don't want them to have 5 years taken off their life if they live in northern China, which is the case. So I think there's a desire for citizens, even in a place like China where there's nothing like a free press, but everybody's got to breathe the air. Nobody is safe from that. And it is now rich enough, and it sees clean tech as a kind of new driver and a technological engineering-driven solution to the problem. So I think it's all the factors that you mentioned, and I think it's a very powerful trend. So I think we'll look back at these years as a turning point, as a sort of silent spring moment. You were mentioning Rachel Carson's book. That book came out, I think, in 1962, but it wasn't until 8 years later that the U.S. even set up the EPA. So these things take time. These are really big changes. This is a very, very large economy, and I think the progress we're seeing is terrific. So the wind power might not all be hooked up, but it's there, and it will be hooked up, and it will be used.
Jake, in your view, how is the carbon budget constraints driving the design-led revolution as you guys are sort of interfacing with your Chinese colleagues right now at Autodesk and with all the partners that you're having join?
Yeah. I just wanted to add one more thing. To the previous question, I think one other aspect that drives all this is also a look, and first of all, the understanding by the government that economic development on the and having environmental pollution at the same time is no longer acceptable. I think they understand that. It's also a matter of securing, and it's a little bit of an energy security issue, I think, as well as the overall maturing of the economy and providing and becoming clean and a green China. With regards to your question just now, well, I think if we look at the China-U.S. agreement that came out, I think for me the significant point here is that China actually made it very public what their side of the agreement means and as objectives for the country and for policies, and to me in any way indicates that that how much China is committed to this, and that I think sort of also trickles down a little bit. So as I said earlier, you see in December we met entrepreneurs who came back from overseas studies and came back with an idea to start rolling out an off-grid solar solution. So these things, and it's really early stage, but they're keen to do this anyway because they see this as a very important part of almost like a service to the country as well, because they have the ability, they understand the tools that makes these things happening, and I believe we will see more of this, and so it really has sort of overall that silent spring effect or a domino effect that sort of trickles down, and we will see more of that.
Gary, do you have anything to add on to the drivers? I mean, we've covered a lot of this, but
well, I think that what Jake just alluded to, at a very, very high level, China's drive to be independent on food and energy does set up a lot of their policies, and I think you're going to see many more deals between China and Russia, not just for natural gas pipelines, but for water pipelines, because a lot of China's resources can't be extracted with domestic water sources. And you have Siberia up to the north, which is basically a huge, vast, untapped, series of resources that the Chinese are going to figure out how to take advantage of, with the agreements with Russia. So there's no question that the energy, food independence, those kind of issues drive a great deal of the higher level policy here.
Well, that's a great segue. Might end up being our last question. We might get one more in. I mean, let me throw this out to each of you. I pontificate regularly in the U.S. marketplace about where the big opportunities are, and a lot of people. There's a lot of agreement. I mean, right now in the U.S., energy storage is a very big area of activity and a lot of focus and investment. Net zero buildings and there's just a whole slew of things. But let's not talk about that. I want to go round robin here. Maybe we'll go Jake, Gary, Mark. But from your vantage point in Asia, really close to China or in China, what are 2 or 3 big opportunities that you see over the next 3 to 5 years against all the trends we've just been talking about? Because we got a lot of companies on the line here, and I think they're interested in, where are the opportunities in China? Why don't we start with you, Jake, and then go round robin?
Okay, sure. So there's a couple of things that I think will play an important role. First of all, there is still a massive urbanization drive, and so the aim for energy efficiency in buildings, built environments, retrofitting, built materials, all of this, I think a lot more will come, in my opinion. Gary alluded to this a little bit from a water point of view. I think there is going to be a water challenge. I mean, so I think solutions for wastewater management and gray water and these sort of things will play a role. And then I would also still say that while the targets for reaching electric vehicles in China have been not achieved to the level that originally was projected to be or wanted to be, I think that whole connection with recharging infrastructure, I think we'll see more development as well. It goes a little bit hand in hand. Obviously, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. What goes first, the electric vehicle?
Great. Yeah, no, sure. And I think there'll be overlap among you guys. Yeah. Gary, how about you? And if there was an overlap, you just tell us.
So I think there's definitely an overlap. I mean, I think that the whole idea of the building environment, if folks look at what Rocky Mountain Institute has done, we helped bring them to China a couple of years ago, and what they've been able to do in terms of starting to influence, policy, and they took Amy Levin's book, Reinventing Fire, translated to Chinese. Some of those principles are getting implemented, and that's a great guideline actually for certain kinds of companies in terms of looking at investable opportunities here. I think power management systems, and again, going back to the concept of assume that the Chinese will have a manufacturing capability to build discrete devices very cheaply, then if you come in and you have really good integration solutions or really good software solutions that tie those together, I think that's a great value add to where China's industrial or a clean tech manufacturing base is moving.
Great. And Mark?
I mean, these are exactly the points I would have hit. Let me just add on the building energy efficiency that even by Chinese government calculations, it's roughly 4 times cheaper to build a new building and use energy efficiency than to build the coal-fired power plant to heat and light and cool that inefficient building. Forget about the environmental side, forget about the carbon side. It's much cheaper to do it, and there's something structural in the Chinese system which is impelling people to throw up lousy buildings which are energy hogs. And for the people, as Jake and Gary were alluding to, who can, whether they're the Schneider Electrics, a French company whose CEO is relocated to Hong Kong because China and Asia are driving growth, or other companies who can figure out how to run those build and run those buildings and factories efficiently. There's an enormous opportunity. It's in the services side. You know, as we've said, the manufacturing in China is second to none in the world. But if you can help them build, integrate and run complex systems that'll be more energy efficient, the Chinese will welcome you with open arms, and you might even make some money off it.
Thank you very much, everyone. We're near the end. Gary, I want to ask you a quick question because I've got a number of questions from businesses that might like to enter the Chinese market, and maybe others could address this. But are there some, first steps that a company needs to take? Obviously, you have to make partnerships. It's very hard to navigate China. But very quickly, just for some of the folks who have asked this question, what are some of the initial steps they might take as they start to explore how they might sell their product or service or do partnerships in China?
I think that it's a good question. I think if you look at the Bay Area, you look at Los Angeles, Seattle, places that I know, there's all sorts of Asian market development institutions. Some are China specific, some are Japan specific, some are Pan-Asian. In Silicon Valley, you have Thai, the Indian entrepreneurs. You have Chinese equivalents of that. So that's a very good place to spend some time and talk to the folks that have been in the U.S., probably have some ties back to China, have some sense maybe of actually the issues that a particular company or product might face. The Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, the American Chamber, is a fantastic resource that people don't use nearly as much as they probably should.
Well, that's good to know.
And I think that, but I think there's a lot of things just in your backyard, and then sometimes within your own company. If the company is sizable, look at who you have in the company that actually has some experience doing business in China from former organizations. It's not always. It's actually sometimes funny to look at inside your own firm and realize you have skills there you didn't realize you had.
Mark, at the Asia Business Council, from your vantage point, are some good organizations? Can they come to you? I'm just wondering if folks are looking for entry points.
We're a pretty closed sort of organization. I'm always happy to hear from people, but I think that Gary's suggestion about the American Chamber of Commerce, not just in Shanghai, but also Beijing and Hong Kong, those are among the 3 largest AmChams in the world. So sure, always happy to hear from people, but I think these sort of more outwardly facing organizations are better places to start.
Great. Jake, anything to add to our audience on this point?
No, actually, I think both Gary and
Great. So, guys, I really want to thank you, and it's been very enlightening for me. I want to thank all of our panelists, Jake, Gary, and Mark, for their time and insights today. Also want to thank our partner Autodesk for making today's webinar possible. Please note that this webinar has been recorded, and we plan to post a link on our website most likely sometime tomorrow. In addition to posting it on YouTube, we will look for an equivalent to post it for our audience members and folks who want to access it from China. So thank you all again to all of you and to our panelists. Have a good day.